you remember when you first learned about the concept of free and open source software?
Yeah, I think when I was really getting into tech, and I remember coming out of that kind of entrepreneurship, the world was kind of dominated by Windows and DOS. And, some of the biggest things you would do were just hooking up Windows networking because it was so complex. Setting up an Exchange server, right? This is when people used to host the Exchange server in the building and try to back things up. And when I was really like, hey, I wanted to go into industry, I noticed that a lot of the job requirements were Unix based. And I don't even know where you could buy AIX. Like there was like, you don't go to Amazon to buy AIX. This thing came with your LPAR or your mainframe. It's like, it was very inaccessible. But I was like, well, what is AIX? What is Solaris? These are Unixes. And you say, oh, what's Unix? And then you go look around and it's like, hey, the history behind Unix is very complex. You got the AT&T folks doing their thing. Then you have the BSDs, which try to implement this, but then they get into some legal weirdness. But then there's this distro called FreeBSD. And I'm like, free sounds like the right price for me. That's what I got. And so you get FreeBSD and you have to install it. And so you find that old hardware, that old HP Reliant computer thing you have on your desk, or that gateway computer, they're not even in business anymore. And you stick the CD in, and it's like, all right, you get to install this operating system. And I remember back then, they did a lot of work to try to make it look like Windows. Like that whole KDE desktop experience, like, oh, Open Office, Microsoft Office. And so you get this thing installed, and the first thing I thought about was like, how can this be free? There must be some trade-off we're making. Who would ever have this philosophy? Because, I grew up in America. Anytime you create value, you must try to exercise maximum return and make money. Microsoft was making money at that time. Bill Gates is the richest person in the world, largely because of the software game. So who was these other people? And I think my first encounter was with never met the person, but Richard Stallman. And I was just reading the story about Richard Stallman's kind of crusade at MIT of like, hey, this whole userland component. And I remember they were sticking to this concept of GNU Linux. Like if you just say Linux, you were missing a big part of the stack. Linus Torvalds did a good job, but you can't just use a kernel. Literally, there's no interface. There's no shell. There's no commands. You need all that other stuff. And when combined, you get this GNU Linux thing. That's like, oh, so this bash. But it turns out a lot of the proprietary Unix-like utilities, this one person was kind of largely responsible for just making clones of them. And in a way that if you're the BSDs, if you're the kernels, they're debating on which way to go, monolithic versus modular. But you had these user lands that were roughly similar. And so when I started learning FreeBSD, because I thought it was the most pure, I wanted to get closest to history that I could. And the timeline brought me to FreeBSD. And I remember doing my first interview, not at Google. I was at Google 8 years. But before that, I was at Google a time prior. It was like my first non-entrepreneur job. And I remember going to that interview and they were just asking me all of these Linux questions. I mean, it was deep. This thing, that thing. And luckily for me, a lot of the things are roughly the same in terms of user land. But then we started to get into how the kernel deals with things like threads, how the kernel manages memory, the Linux file system interface, virtual versus actual file systems. And I was like, look, I don't know. But if you're talking about FreeBSD, Macworld all the way up, that's my game. And boy, did I hit the jackpot. There's three interviewers at this thing, and they're just grilling you. And I look and I said FreeBSD, and one of the interviewers' faces lit up. He was like, oh, FreeBSD, you say? And I looked down and he had the FreeBSD mascot is Beastie, like this little devil with horns with the, pitchfork. And he had that tattooed on his calf. I was like, oh, the stars are aligned. And FreeBSD folks, they are a tribe. Everybody, you ain't running FreeBSD unless you exactly know what you're doing. And when I said that, and he started asking me about FreeBSD, the interview quickly pivoted to a what do you know to like this geek out session of extreme validation. So that was kind of my first encounter with this whole free and open source. Free as in speech, not as in beer. And it's one of these things where it's like there's a deep philosophy behind this because at the same time I was becoming a minimalist and I was challenging my own relationship with the materialistic world. And to see this software movement align with that resonated at multiple levels.